Welcome to the Copeland Coaching Podcast, where it's all about turning your job search into a slam dunk. Your host is Angela Copeland.
Welcome to the Copeland Coaching Podcast. I'm your host, Angela Copeland. Live on the phone with me today, I have Roy Cohen in New York. Roy is a career coach at his very own firm, Roy Cohen Career Management. He's worked extensively with clients from diverse industries and backgrounds, most notably Wall Street, retailing and fashion, publishing, law, consumer products, and entertainment. In addition to coaching for over 20 years, Roy is also the author of the Wall Street Professional Survival Guide. Roy, thanks for joining me today.
It's my pleasure. It's very nice to speak with you, Angela.
Yes, it's so great to speak with you. And you mentioned you're in Manhattan, is that right?
Yes, I'm in New York City, and but my practice is quite frankly, it's global. Technology has allowed me to work with clients throughout the United States as well as overseas. I have a number of clients in Asia, in Western Europe, and in Latin America.
Oh, that's excellent. Do you meet on Skype or via the phone? How do you meet with them?
Skype, FaceTime, and phone, depending upon how much time we're spending in a meeting.
Oh, that's great. Well, as I mentioned in the introduction, you've been working with job seekers for over 20 years. And I guess, when you first sit down with someone, what are some of the first steps that you take to help them kind of start to develop their game plan, so to speak?
Well, the very first step is really to understand why they're meeting with a career coach, whether it's with me or somebody else. And that is critical because I want to make sure that they have realistic expectations about the process and that they also are willing to invest their time and energy in making sure that this process is successful. So that's the very first step. And then we figure out what it is that they're working towards. Mm-hmm. Without a clear idea about a target and what they envision for themselves, then it's very difficult to establish a job search game plan. It's kind of interesting, Angela. Often clients will reach out to me and they'll say, I'm reaching out to you because I need a resume. And my response typically is, well, without an idea about what you want to position yourself for, having a resume really serves no purpose. You need to make sure that the resume is focused around whatever themes are driving your career at this particular point in time.
Oh, I totally agree. I sometimes will have clients come in and on the first meeting, they're actually looking for a resume writer. And I really discourage them from sort of doing that because I think they need to put in that work to figure out what their goals really are. And I often find that people who use resume writers, they don't always know what the content of the resume is, and it may or may not represent them in the correct way.
Absolutely. When you rely on a resume writer to produce a document for you, you have to also then accept that they may present information in your resume which doesn't necessarily capture what it is that you do well, what is uniquely distinguishing about your background, and they may use language that's, quite frankly, not correct. So there's an accuracy issue, and often resumes that are written by writers are just, unless it's a collaborative process, they're speculating on what it is that you do, and there's a high margin of error.
Right, absolutely. I totally agree. I've noticed that clients who sit down and try to explain their resume to me who've used a resume writer often make apologies as they review it because they say, "Oh, that's not quite right. They didn't represent that correctly." So I think that's a very good point. Well, as I mentioned in the beginning in the intro, you wrote a book, the Wall Street Professional Survival Guide, and that's actually one of the areas that you specialize in is Wall Street, which is...
Yeah, absolutely. And I have the... I'm proud to say that the book actually became a bestseller, so it's a very exciting development. and it's been a really interesting resource that I feel very fortunate that I've been able to make available to folks. I wrote the book initially because I felt like there were a lot of folks out there who couldn't afford to work with a career coach, and this would be a way for me to capture many, many years of experience working with clients, a lot of them Wall Street professionals, and share with them some of the knowledge that I gained over those many years.
Oh, that's so great. So for our listeners who may be interested in that industry, I mean, my perception is that it's a pretty high pressure, high paced industry, but what tips do you have on how to break into the industry, so to speak?
Well, I'm going to address that question in a moment, but there was one other reason why I wrote the book, and that was because I wanted to be able to demonstrate to my clients, and this is a very relevant point, that that it's in order to achieve success in a very tough market, you need to be willing to break through barriers and to demonstrate that you're really passionate and committed to success. And getting a book published, especially in this current climate, it's tough. And I wanted to be able to show my clients that if I'm encouraging them to put themselves out there, then I would be willing to do that myself, and that I could break through some of those barriers. And in fact, had a number of publishers who were excited about the book. So that's the first thing. So if I'm looking at Wall Street as a career destination, you need to be able to show people that you're able to that you're committed to pursuing a goal, that you will that you're tenacious, hardworking, that you're not easily discouraged. For Wall Street, you need to be able to show that you are smart. And that's got to be reflected in a history of accomplishment.
Right, absolutely.
And you also need to be able to show that you have demonstrated good judgment. And increasingly, that your decision-making has been informed by ethical, that there are ethical themes that drive your decision-making, that you act responsibly, that you are somebody who makes the right decision typically, that you take the high road because of because there have been so many challenges in and on Wall Street over the last 5 or so years, in large part surrounding the mortgage security fiasco. A lot of firms are focused around regulatory issues and compliance. So there is a need for folks to demonstrate that they act responsibly. So that's another issue. I said that you're smart, and it should be reflected in your accomplishments. You should also be able to demonstrate that you have a track record of success. So it's not just accomplishments, that there is consistent success, because Wall Street is really about being better, bigger, better, smarter, faster, quicker. And that's how individuals are typically measured. So you need to be able to show that you have a history of consistently achieving out-of-the-box results.
That's...
And then last... Go ahead.
Oh, I just was going to say that it's really interesting that you bring up ethics. I would not have thought about that right off, but it makes perfect sense given sort of all of the different issues that have come up over the years in Wall Street.
Oh, absolutely. That is one of the principal themes that defines Wall Street nowadays. The idea of integrity and operating at a high level where you are somebody whose track record is squeaky clean, and that is something that is undebatable in this market. So that's important to recognize when you're positioning yourself. There's no room for sloppiness or compromise in terms of your integrity.
Absolutely.
And of most importance, and I left this one out because this is really probably the most important element in this very complex equation. You need to be able to show that you have subject matter expertise. If you're looking at Wall Street, they want to know that you're smart and that you are an expert in whatever it is you're positioning yourself for. And if you are pursuing a career in Wall Street, that you are the very best at what you do.
That makes perfect sense. So as you work with different clients, are there certain types of people that you think, oh, this person would be a great fit for this type of role, or this person is probably not a good fit? Like, what characteristics sort of differentiate people who would or wouldn't be great for Wall Street?
Well, typically I encourage people to do research on their own about the various roles that people can play on Wall Street. Wall Street is made up of many, many different kinds of functional areas and people who have very different kinds of personalities. So if you are more analytically oriented, you like to dig deep and do research, then research or analysis may be an interesting area for you to explore. You don't have to be an outgoing person in order to be an expert researcher. If you are pursuing a career as an investment banker, then you really need to be focused on having very sharp interpersonal skills so that you're a good salesperson and marketer. And that's the same for institutional sales. It's also the same for individuals who work in your local branch bank as financial advisors. Those folks need to be able to connect with people. And if you don't feel comfortable working with people, then that's not the right career path for you to be pursuing. So I have a lot of clients who say to me, well, I'm really interested in doing financial analysis. I love advising, or I love thinking about what people need to do to protect themselves so that they can be able to retire at some point. But I really don't like working with people. Then being a financial advisor is not the right direction.
Right. That's interesting. Well, that's great feedback. And it's a good point that there are many different kinds of roles on Wall Street. So if you're interested, to consider where you might fit into that big picture.
Well, there are a whole range of roles. Wall Street is made up of two kind of separate sides of a coin. There's the sell side, and those are institutions that create and market big deals and sell securities. And then there's the buy side, and those are the firms we think of when we think of portfolio managers and the people who manage our individual wealth as well as institutional wealth. So it's important if people are looking at Wall Street to understand what kind of role would be first and foremost interesting to them, that they're qualified for, and where they would feel like they'd have the potential to be most successful.
Absolutely. That's great.
And then there's always back office operations, which is much more about ensuring that everything happens smoothly and seamlessly.
Oh, interesting. That's great. Well, so earlier in your career, you worked in outplacement services for Goldman Sachs, which is really interesting. And, I occasionally will work with clients who come in and they've just been laid off or fired. It's a very emotional kind of experience to go through. And so I was wondering if you can give our listeners a few suggestions on, some of the first steps they might take if they've been fired, and when people start to ask them, why did you leave your job? What should they say?
Well, actually, let me modify what you said. I wasn't delivering outplacement services for Goldman Sachs. I was the firm's career counselor.
Okay.
And they were my largest client for about 14 years.
Great.
And so I happened to work with many individuals when they were exiting the company.
Okay.
But I wasn't the deliverer of outplacement services. But I assumed that part of that is. I assume that is part of my responsibilities over the years.
Oh, that makes sense.
So much of what I work with clients on were career transition matters, and then over time, inevitably, many of the clients I work with were transitioning out of the firm. So in terms of when folks get fired, and especially if they're transitioning out involuntarily, the very first step is to restore confidence. When you are dealing with individuals, especially individuals who are working in very high-profile, highly visible positions, there's some shame that they experience and fear. And the very first step is really to address the shame and the fear and the shame, the fear, and the confusion that they might have before they just go out to the market and broadcast their availability.
Right.
It's very dangerous when individuals shoot from the hip if they've been fired and they just impulsively start to call everyone.
Right.
So the very first step is to deal with the very personal issues so that we can restore confidence, and then make sure that they're clear about what they want to do next. And then we have to get the story straight. And that story is everything from what do you want to do next to why'd you leave the company you were working for.
Absolutely. And when they're answering that question, why did you leave the company that you're working for, if it wasn't their decision, I mean, how do you suggest that they answer that question to kind of...
Well, it depends on how the separation occurred. If they were part of a large downsizing, I would provide some context. I would say, well, there have been a number of layoffs over the years, and I was feeling that our division was increasingly vulnerable because sales were off, or my boss and my boss's boss were separated a year ago. So when this happened, I wasn't entirely surprised. So notice what I'm conveying there. That it happened, yes. That it was a downsizing, yes. But you know what? You're in the driver's seat, and I sort of suspected that there might be that this event might occur. But I'm dealing with it, and I am moving forward.
Right.
That's what people want to hear, that you're prepared to move forward. That any fallout has been addressed, and it's not something that you're carrying into your interview or your next job.
Right. And the other thing I kind of heard as you were saying that is it's not so much about me. It's more about the environment at the company, or there were some, bigger changes going on, and it wasn't necessarily related to my performance, for example.
Well, that actually raises an interesting question. People get fired for a lot of reasons. So what happens if you're fired for performance and it's not part of a downsizing?
Right.
So that's an entirely different matter that would need to be addressed. And again, this is really about strategy and positioning so that you don't present the events in a way which will immediately eliminate you from consideration if you're a candidate out in a very competitive market. So, for example, say I'm sitting down with a client who's been fired, I will first gather some historical information. Tell me a little bit more about what happened. Tell me about your relationship with your boss. So, as an example, I was working with a client a couple of months ago who, in our first meeting, he said, "Oh, I got fired. My boss hated me." And I said, "Well, what happened?" He said, "Well, we had a reorganization. My boss, who I'd worked for a number of years, and we had a great relationship. He was moved to a different part of the company. I found myself reporting to somebody, and it was like oil and water." And I said, "Oh, very interesting." I said, "Has this ever happened to you before?" And he said, "No." So I said, "Well, part of your story then needs to be about the fact that you had an amazing relationship with your boss, that there was a reorganization, and that for the first time in your career you were working with an individual, and you just never seemed to agree on best strategy. And you just suspected that at some point that there was a potential that you might be vulnerable."
Right.
So notice it's a very different story I'm telling.
Right. I think.
And I'm being honest that I'm not saying that I wasn't fired. I'm just talking about how my situation changed, and the relationship just wasn't good, but it was never a problem before.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And
so all of a sudden, I'm sharing something very relevant, which may convince whoever it is I'm talking to that what I'm saying is legitimate, and it sounds very reasonable.
Right, absolutely. And I think it's a very different story than when the client first said, well, my boss hated me and he fired me.
Yeah.
That's really
And
different.
typically there's always a backstory.
Mm-hmm. Right. And I think the longer version is much more understandable and, relatable than my boss hated me and he fired me. I think
Absolutely.
the more detail in that situation is better. Well, along the same lines, I work with a lot of job seekers who are starting to find their skill sets becoming obsolete. This happens a lot with people who are older. Sometimes I see it with people who've been in traditional marketing, for example. I'm sure you must see this in your practice. How do you help your clients to kind of cope with that situation or to try to avoid it from the beginning?
Well, people have a choice. They can either embrace change or they can become increasingly irrelevant and obsolete.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact is that we are living and working in a world where change is happening at a pace that is increasingly escalated. And if we don't embrace change, then we risk becoming dinosaurs.
Mm-hmm.
So if somebody comes to me and says, well, my skills are obsolete, I'd say, well, what happened? Why weren't you taking classes? Why weren't you figuring out what you needed to do as the next step? That's where the intervention has to happen.
Mm-hmm.
So if somebody says to me that they don't want to work anymore, then you know what? Having obsolete skill set is not an issue. But if they're telling me that they want to continue working, they can't have it both ways. If you want to continue to work and you want to be paid fairly, then you've got to make sure that your skill set stays relevant and is on the cutting edge. That's the reason why a lot of boomers have trouble repositioning themselves, because they kind of got lazy. And I wouldn't say this unless I was a boomer too.
Mm-hmm.
And technology for me is an acquired skill. I have to learn it every step of the way, and it's not easy.
Absolutely. I think you bring a really good point up, which is that you have to be proactive in your own career. And, the people that I notice who maybe are falling a little behind are sometimes those who are relying on their employer, for example, to be the one who is keeping them trained, rather than saying, I see this trend and I choose to get myself trained, or to take a class or to learn something new on my own. They seem to be a little more passive with that regard.
Well, it's a very interesting position to be in, because, look, as an advisor to folks, clients can say to me, well, it doesn't matter for you because you either work for yourself or you don't have to worry about being in an organization where your skill set is obsolete. And I will typically say to clients, the reality is that all of us need to be aware of the changes that are occurring around us, in large part due to technology,
Mm-hmm.
to changing demand in the marketplace, to certain functions becoming obsolete and unnecessary. And if that's the case, then we've got to prepare for that. And that means that we maintain a robust and dynamic network, and that network should be providing us with information so that we can stay current in terms of what the market is needing from individuals like us, so that we can continue to be attractive and employable. I think that there are many excuses that we can offer up, but the bottom line is that it's really about devoting time and energy and resources to staying whole professionally.
Mm-hmm. No, and I would argue, even with coaching, even though you're self-employed, that, for example, when you started coaching 20 years ago, I doubt that you had things like a website, and you certainly did not have a Twitter. And so you have had to keep up with, trends as well. They just may be a little different.
Well, what you also need to do is you need to learn how to embrace it and feel joyful about it. so many people nowadays operate in a state of fear. And if we really want to continue working, we've got to love what we do, and we've got to love the idea that it's changing and that it offers us new opportunity to grow and develop and to really sort of evolve over time. And the fact is that retirement is not an option for many folks nowadays for a number of reasons. One, they may not have the resources to retire, but if we're living longer and healthier lives, to not work for 30 years or 40 years is an impractical notion. So I think in order to stay employable, we just have to become better disciplined in terms of acquiring the right skills, and also recognizing that at some point we may even dramatically change what we're doing. I just had a meeting with an individual who was the head of HR for a company, and she feels like she's ready to move on and move in a slightly different direction. And that's a very bold decision for her to make, and she's a little nervous about it, but she's excited about pursuing this new direction. And part of her strategy right now is to immerse herself in this new avenue.
Oh, that's great. So I guess that would probably be your recommendation to anyone that's trying to transition to a new field, especially later, is to immerse yourself in that new field. Is that kind of where you start?
Immersion or hobby, it's about having exposure. It's also about having some tie to that new area. So even if we're going to professional associations, maybe taking a class or two, it's a way for us to begin to expand our frame of reference and our skill set.
Oh, that's great. Well, as we talked about earlier, you focus a lot on Wall Street. And, I was meeting a few months back with someone who had been a trader for his entire career, and he was in his 60s now. And he was trying to find something really different, something in a completely different area or different field. I mean, for someone like that, I'm sure you must work with clients who are transitioning out of Wall Street. Where do you sort of help them to begin to find something new?
Well, one of the first steps is to figure out what it is that they like doing, what they liked about their careers. Are they transitioning out because they no longer have an interest in trading, or it's just that there seem to be far fewer jobs and the barriers to finding a new position are insurmountable? Have they just outgrown it? It really is an important first question to examine. So if they said to me, look, there aren't that many opportunities, but I really love trading, then one obvious option would be to look at a vendor that provides services to trading platforms. So there are a whole range of options that could exist. It depends how far removed they want to be from what they've spent most of their career doing. So that's the first step. It's really to understand where their centers of satisfaction exist, what they've enjoyed, what they haven't enjoyed about their career. Are they exiting because they don't believe that that opportunities will exist? And then I say to them, well, maybe what we need to do before you throw the baby out with the bathwater is make sure that you've done everything possible to conduct a successful job search. So that's often an important consideration. Sometimes clients will come to me and they'll say, I don't want to do this anymore because there are no opportunities. And then when we talk about what they've done in their job search, they've lacked creativity and chutzpah, and they've been very ineffective in how they've managed the actual job search itself. So I typically will say, before you give it up, let's make sure you give it a good shot.
Right. Oh, that's great. That's very good advice. Well, another industry that I know you focused on some as well is both fashion and entertainment. And occasionally clients, especially young clients, will come to me and are really excited to get involved in these areas. From your perspective, what does it take to break into these areas, and what cautions do you offer to people who are interested in fashion and entertainment?
And what I missed, what caution do I offer? I didn't hear the word you said.
Right. What caution would you offer to them?
Okay.
Because
Well, it's very it's a great question. Typically, when folks want to enter an industry, it's really important to demonstrate that you have some relevant experience. So if you're in college and you want to work in retail, get a job working for a retail store, either on a part-time basis or during the summer. And if you want to work in the entertainment industry, you have no choice but to make sure that you have internships on your resume, and also recognizing what entertainment is. Entertainment has broadened out to represent the delivery of information and news and music and video on multiple platforms. So the more you can show that you have experience in a number of those areas, the more exciting you're going to be when it comes to looking for a full-time job. I am on TV a lot, and whenever I go to a studio, I'm on Fox quite often. There's always a young intern there, and they're typically college students. So I'll say to them, well, how'd you get the job, or how'd you get this internship? Or if it's a young assistant producer, or if it's a gopher, I'll say, how'd you end up here? And they'll typically say, I was an intern in college.
Oh, wow. That's great.
So that's how you break in. It's by either doing it for free or doing it on a part-time basis. It's juggling multiple balls and showing that you're really committed to making it happen.
That's great. And I think also maybe being aware that it may not pay a whole lot in the beginning, and kind of being prepared for that would be important as well.
Well, virtually nothing pays a whole lot in the very beginning,
Right.
except for Wall Street, and even those numbers are changing to reflect the reality of life on Wall Street now. So I think to your point, entry level means entry level salary too, and individuals, recent college graduates, need to be aware of that, but they also need to be mindful that if they want to graduate from an entry-level role, they need to be very mindful and strategic in how they approach their careers. It's never too early to plan out where you want to be and how you want to get there.
Absolutely. And I think, too, for those individuals who may be later in their careers that have decided that, hey, I always wanted to pursue entertainment, it's remembering that when you start over, you may not be at the same salary level in a new industry that you are at in your current industry, especially for something like this.
Well, you're absolutely right, and it's also about having realistic expectations. The fact is that I may be wanting to pursue a career as a TV anchor person, but that's not going to happen for me because the industry is not necessarily receptive to men in their late 50s. On the other hand, I can be a subject matter expert and have plenty of opportunities to be on TV. So I need to be very practical in terms of how I pursue a goal, and I don't want to just pursue something that either is impractical and doesn't go anywhere, or ultimately ends up feeling very frustrating for me because I didn't do my homework. We may want something, but it just may not happen. So, for example, I may say I want to be a brain surgeon. Well, you know what? It ain't going to happen because I'm not prepared to do the work that I need to do, either to go back to school or to commit those many years to pursuing the process. So realistic expectations, knowing what is valued in terms of candidates for those sorts of positions, that will make you far more effective in being able to position yourself for a career change.
Right, absolutely. Well, so on the topic of sort of the financial piece, how important is negotiation to you? I mean, there's been a lot in the news over the past month about, whether or not we should be asking for a raise or not. Do you have any advice or tips with regards to negotiation?
Sure. I'm not a believer that negotiation is unavailable to folks. my thinking is that if we create excitement around our career, if we're in job search and we have multiple opportunities that are presented to us, we share that excitement with whoever it is that whoever it is that is a part of our job search universe. And if they feel like there is a potential to lose us, they're going to be much more receptive to negotiating with us for a more attractive salary. And if we're on the job and we're really working successfully, companies nowadays don't want to lose valued employees because the cost to train new folks is far more it's a far greater investment than it is to it would be to give somebody a nominal salary increase. Mm-hmm. So my thinking is that you need to be able to present why you want a salary increase if you're on a job and you're doing a great job, and you need to do it in a way that's not adversarial. Mm-hmm. When it becomes an ultimatum, then you get into trouble.
Right. Absolutely. Well, do you have any tips so if someone has never negotiated before and say they've gotten an offer at a new company, do you have any tips that you might offer to them to encourage them towards negotiation?
Well, before you negotiate, know what is realistic and appropriate for that particular job. Mm-hmm. If the number is way off that they've presented to you and you've done your homework and you've discovered that the range is entirely different and far more attractive, then there's a disconnect there. And mm-hmm. you've got to examine, well, why are they so far off from what seems to be the prevailing range for the industry? And why are they giving me an offer that seems to be so low? So there are two disconnects that really need to be understood. Secondly, if you are in a situation where you can afford to walk away mm-hmm. Because the offer is not attractive enough, then you can be a little bolder in terms of how you negotiate. Mm-hmm. So whenever folks negotiate, what I typically say is negotiate the tough stuff first, because if you do the easy stuff initially, like start date, by the time they get to salary, it's going to feel like they've already given up on a couple of items. So typically what I suggest is you negotiate the big stuff up front. I'm so excited about the opportunity. I can easily envision working here. There are just a couple of matters we need to talk about. I'm wondering if there's any flexibility with respect to the salary. Let me explain to you, a little bit more about what I bring to the table. In addition to what you're wanting this individual to do, I can also do the following. I hope that I was able to convey that in my interviews with you. Is there any wiggle room in terms of the compensation? Mm-hmm. So it's a less confrontational approach and less ultimatum-driven.
Absolutely. And that's very much along the lines of what I work with my clients on. I find that they have a lot of fear around negotiation, especially if they've never done it. And, I think as long as you use this approach, like you mentioned, that is low conflict, the worst that will happen is that they'll say, I'm sorry, we can't change the offer stands.
Well, then you have to decide whether or not the offer is attractive enough. And secondly, is there a sense of urgency? Mm-hmm. So if there's a sense of urgency and they're unwilling and flexible, I typically say, can you accept an offer and then continue to look if you know that they are inflexible for all of the wrong reasons. But if they tell you that their hands are tied and you sort of say, yeah, I get it, and it's still an attractive offer, maybe there's some other elements about the job that you can negotiate or that appeal to you. So
Absolutely.
Just because the salary is not perfect, that doesn't mean that it's a deal breaker.
Absolutely. But I think the thing to remember is that as long as you use this low conflict way of negotiation, the company won't rescind the offer.
Well, the company can actually do whatever they want to do.
Sure.
And sometimes there is, some companies will, if they even get a hint that you're negotiating, will take a hard line. So that's why we have to be very, very careful and know the prevailing history for the company when it comes to negotiating. If you find out that there's absolutely no room for negotiating based upon the research you've done, to introduce it could potentially damage your relationship with the company. And some companies could withdraw offers if they sense dissatisfaction.
Sure. Well, that's very helpful. So one other thing I wanted to ask you about, I think this is a bit of a myth, but I work with a number of clients who want to relocate to a big city, and they often say to me, well, I know they'll pay me more because the cost of living there is more. And my thought is that usually when you apply to a new company and say they're located in New York, they won't necessarily pay you more because they have more talent, there's more competition, and they don't necessarily have to pay more. But what is it that you see with regards to cost of living differences?
Well, what I typically see is that if you are doing job search in another city, they're not going to pay you what you were earning in the city that you're leaving. They're going to pay you the prevailing rate for jobs for people who work in those jobs in the city that you want to work in. So I typically see that as a way to measure cost of living differential. And again, it's about doing your homework. What is the range for these sorts of positions, and does that mesh with my expectations for the cost of living in this particular city, and can I afford to live in that city on that salary?
Absolutely. I think the point
I've had a number of clients who moved to London, and London is a very expensive city to live in, far more expensive than New York, but the salary really wasn't as rich as they wanted, and it had nothing to do with what they were earning in New York. It was just what the company pays.
Absolutely. I think the point that you make about they pay you based on what the rate is in the city where you're going is really important.
Absolutely.
Well, is there any other advice that you'd like to share with our listeners today?
So, actually, just a very simple kind of way of looking at job search. And I typically tell people that the first step is to identify targets that are meaningful for you, and to be able to say to yourself, what do you want to do? What qualifies you to pursue this goal? What do you have to offer? And how will the company benefit? So targets, and being able to address those questions. We need a game plan that you can execute on, and that game plan is everything from your resume to the story you tell people to the explanation about why you're wanting to leave, and then it's also about not falling off the wagon. It's very easy in a tough job market to lose energy, commitment, and focus, and so important to be mindful of the wagon, and I say that parenthetically because that's where people can end up in trouble in job search, because when you fall off the wagon, it can be very disruptive in order to get back on. And also think about job search as a marathon. So if you're sprinting, you're going to end up losing your energy and enthusiasm far too quickly, and we never know when it's we're gonna achieve success. So you've got to be prepared for an extended search.
Oh, that's great. Well, Roy, if our listeners today are interested to reach out to you, say they're looking for coaching, and I know you said you coach internationally, how should they reach out to you? How can they get in touch with you?
Well, my website is careercoachny.com. That's careercoachny.com. And it's easy to find me on the web. So just reach out via the website.
That's great. Well, thank you.
And follow me on Twitter. My handle is @Roy Cohen, ROYCOHEN.
Yes, I saw you had some great tips on Twitter, and you also had some really cute pictures of your dog and some other things.
Thanks.
Absolutely. Well, thank you.
And I'm on LinkedIn as well. So both LinkedIn and Twitter are two easy ways to track me down.
Great, great. Well, Roy, thank you for joining me today. The discussion's been very helpful, and thanks everyone for listening.
You're very welcome, Angela. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Thank you. Tune in next week for another edition of the Copeland Coaching Podcast, and if you haven't yet, please subscribe on iTunes so that you never miss an episode.
Thank you for listening to the Copeland Coaching Podcast today with your host, Angela Copeland. Tune in next time to get more great tips on turning your job search into a slam dunk.